At 04:17 a.m. on March 29, 1944, somewhere along the mud-choked approach roads near Kovel, in the northeastern front of occupied Poland, Field Engineer Corporal Nathan Hale stood beside a Sherman M4A2 that refused to move 1 meter beyond a useless crawl. The tank groaned like an exhausted animal, its tracks barely turning under a weight that seemed to double every time the crew tried to push forward. Dawn was minutes away. Fog rolled low across the marshes, and Hale, with grease covering half his face, already knew the brutal truth. If this tank didn't move soon, the entire column behind it would be exposed to a German counterattack scheduled to hit them before sunrise. The crew inside, Bennett, Kowalski, and Turner, waited silently for a miracle that was not coming. They had no idea that Hale himself, the quiet, almost forgettable engineer they barely spoke to during meals, was the only one who understood why the machine had become a stranded, vulnerable steel coffin. His official assignment was simple: keep the vehicles alive long enough to endure the Soviets' push from the east and the Wehrmacht's collapsing defensive lines from the west. But by early '44, that task was turning into something close to a death sentence. Hale served under the 2nd Armored Division, working between forward repair posts and improvised depots carved out of farmhouses or abandoned rail stations. Tanks came to him mangled, overheated, shot through their armor, or, most frustrating of all, still intact but uncooperative, a word officers used when the machine stubbornly disobeyed every command of the driver. In many cases, units weren't destroyed by enemy fire but by mechanical hesitation, a stalled clutch, an overloaded transmission, torque bleeding away through misaligned sprockets. And the blame always fell on the same easy target: the crew. Pilot error, driver mistake, wrong gear, panic. Every report ended with some variation of crew failure under stress. Hale, who had fit more gearboxes than he could count and had rebuilt transmissions from cannibalized spare parts in the dark, didn't believe that for a second. The Sherman lying before him now was one of the worst cases. 2 weeks prior, a similar failure had cost the life of Lieutenant Daniel Reeves, a young officer from Sacramento who could talk about nothing except cars, Buicks, Oldsmobiles, anything with a convertible top. His tank had stalled while reversing out of a kill zone, the transmission lagging just enough for a German 75mm shell to catch them mid-turn. Only one man crawled out alive, and for months afterward Hale kept remembering how Reeves used to tap the hull before each mission, as if greeting an old friend. "She always gets me home," he'd say, smiling. She hadn't, and Reeves wasn't the only one. On February 19th, Staff Sergeant Michael "Red" Lasker was forced to abandon his tank after the drive ring jammed under torque stress. The retreat exposed the entire platoon, burning through men and machines in minutes. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't individual errors. They were systemic failures, tiny oversights in the design that only revealed themselves when freezing mud, weight load, adrenaline, and battlefield chaos collided. But the manuals were unyielding. The procedures were sacred. Any deviation from factory specifications was strictly forbidden. Engineers like Hale weren't there to innovate. They were there to obey. Yet Hale had been watching something subtle for months: a delay between throttle input and mechanical response. A fraction of a second, barely enough to notice in training conditions. But in combat, that delay widened into tragedy. When crews demanded power, the tank took a breath, hesitated, and only depoys responded. Hale had isolated the culprit, but no one wanted to hear it. A tension compensator buried deep behind the left final drive was losing strength under repeated stress. The springs fatigued faster in cold conditions. The manual claimed the issue was negligible. The battlefield said otherwise. As Hale studied the Sherman before him, mud dripping from the bogies like thick blood, he realized he had reached his breaking point. Another stall, another crew trapped in a metal box waiting to die, and the higher-ups would again pin it on the driver. No one would account for the small, nearly invisible weakness hidden behind layers of armor. Hale knew exactly what needed to be done. He had known for weeks, but doing it meant violating 3 separate regulations, including the explicit directive that no engineer was allowed to modify compensator tension ratios without factory approval. The idea was deemed unsafe, unpredictable, and mechanically irresponsible. Words Hale had memorized from the disciplinary poster hanging inside the depot, the same poster that seemed helplessly ironic now, with a silent battlefield breathing down his neck. Before the war, Hale had been a tractor mechanic in rural Kansas, where improvisation wasn't a skill but a survival instinct. When a combine broke during harvest, you didn't wait for permission. If you had to use a piece of wire or hammer a bent plate into place, you did it. Something in him still lived in that world. A world where you fixed things because someone needed them fixed, not because a manual told you the correct sequence. But this wasn't a cornfield. This was the Eastern Front, the deadliest convergence of steel and desperation in modern history. And if he was wrong, he wouldn't just blow up a tank. He could be court-martialed before nightfall. Still, the deaths of Reeves, Lasker, and half a dozen others gnawed at him like a constant wound. Each loss replayed itself in his mind, accompanied by the same bitter sentence. If the tank had moved, they would have lived. Now he looked at Kowalski, the youngest of the crew, barely 20, sitting on the turret edge with a face drained of sleep and hope. The kid had a letter from his sister tucked inside his jacket, one he read every night before collapsing into whatever dry spot he could find. Hale knew that if he did nothing, Kowalski might be another name on the list, and he couldn't endure one more. He wiped his hands on his uniform, took a breath that tasted of cold metal, oil fumes, and rising dread, and made his choice. No more funerals caused by a hesitation that should never have existed. No more useless reports blaming the wrong men. It was time to break the rules. Hale crawled under the tank, flashlight between his teeth, and began removing the armored plate shielding the compensator housing. The metal screeched softly, too loudly for comfort, but no officers were nearby. The air smelled of frozen mud and warm engine oil, an odd contrast that always reminded him how machines seem to breathe before battle. His fingers, stiff from cold, fought the bolts. One slipped and sliced a gash across his knuckle. Blood dripped onto the frozen earth. He didn't stop. Hale reached the compensator housing and felt the familiar bitterness rise in his chest. The spring assembly inside had been designed for predictable terrain and perfect maintenance cycles, conditions that existed only in drawing boards and factories, never in the frozen, shell-torn mud of the Eastern Front. He angled the flashlight, watching the tiny coil shudder with each vibration from the idling engine. The tension was wrong, weak, hesitant, the same mechanical stutter that had doomed Reeves and Lasker and every other man the reports blamed for driver miscalculation. Hale exhaled slowly, his breath forming a faint cloud beneath the tank, and pulled a small canvas pouch from his jacket. Inside were two items that no engineer was supposed to use in the field: a shortened tension wedge he had filed down in secret, and a reinforced coil scavenged from a wrecked Stuart light tank 3 weeks earlier. He had kept them hidden in his kit, knowing that one day his frustration would outrun his fear. He removed the old spring carefully, mindful that one slip could send it flying like a razor-edged bullet. His hands worked with the precision of a surgeon operating on a patient who could detonate at any moment. Each movement felt heavier because he knew exactly what he was doing, violating Technical Order 2-175. Subsection B, Paragraph 3. No field modification of compensatory spring systems without explicit authorization. The line echoed through his mind with every bolt he loosened. He pushed it away. The battlefield didn't care about authorization. When he inserted the reinforced coil, the fit was almost perfect. Almost. He narrowed his eyes. The new spring needed just a fraction less slack to function properly under stress. He reached for the wedge, a stupid little piece of metal filed in the dark, shaped by instinct, not regulation, yet it could change everything. Hale slid it into place, tapping it lightly with the handle of his wrench. The coil tightened, humming with a tension the Sherman had never truly possessed before. Hale wiped his bleeding hand on his trousers again and muttered, "All right, old girl. Breathe for them this time." He reassembled the housing, bolted everything in place, and crawled back out from under the tank. The sky was beginning to lighten into a pale, exhausted blue. In a few minutes, German reconnaissance planes would be circling overhead. Bennett leaned out from the hatch. "We dead in the water, Nate?" Hale shook his head, climbed to the driver's side, and motioned for Turner to start the engine. The Sherman rumbled alive, shuddering as if waking from a fever. Hale watched the left track closely. Every previous attempt it had lurched sluggishly, dragging behind the right like a wounded limb. "Engage," he said. Turner eased the throttle. The tank moved, quickly, instantly. No hesitation, no breath of delay. Hale felt something electric race up his spine. Again! Turner pushed harder, and the Sherman surged forward with a responsiveness that none of them had ever felt. Bennett blinked. "What the hell did you do?" Hale forced his voice to stay neutral. "Just cleaned out the housing. Nothing big. But inside, he felt the weight of it, the mixture of relief, fear, and the strange pride that comes only when you know you've broken the rules for the right reason. There was no time to celebrate. Radio reports confirmed movement, German armor pushing toward their flank, trying to cut off the entire regiment before daylight. The column needed to move immediately. The commander ordered all Shermans forward, and Hale climbed onto the side of the modified tank, gripping the handrail as they advanced into the fog. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows. Engines growled. Metal clanked. Every man knew the ambush was coming. They just didn't know when. At 05:11 a.m., the first shell screamed out of the tree line, slamming into the ground ahead of the lead tank and erupting in a blinding fountain of earth and fire. Hale felt the shockwave hit his chest. "Contact! Contact!" Voices roared across the radios. German Panzer IVs emerged from the mist like armored phantoms, firing before their silhouettes were fully visible. The American tanks shifted formation. Turner cursed and jammed the throttle. This was the moment where the compensator always faltered, where the delay widened into a fatal window, where men died with the throttle still pressed to the floor. But not today. The Sherman responded instantly, pivoting sharper than Turner had ever managed under pressure. Hale felt the machine move beneath him with a fluidity that bordered on unnatural, as if the tank had shed years of fatigue in one breath. A German shell hissed past them by centimeters. "Holy, she's actually turning!" Turner shouted. Hale didn't answer. He was too focused on the numbers in his head, on the torque, on the sound of the tracks digging into cold mud with perfect synchrony. The crew fired. The first round struck a Panzer's turret ring, sending sparks erupting into the fog. Bennett reloaded fast, firing again before the Germans could adjust. The Panzer jolted, flames spewing from its engine compartment. Another tank attempted to flank them from the left, but Turner swung the Sherman around with a move that would have been physically impossible just hours earlier. Hale's heart pounded. The modification wasn't just working, it was transforming the Sherman into something it had never been. Responsive, aggressive, alive. The battle was chaos. Smoke, flashes of fire, the metallic scream of ricochets. But word spread quickly through the platoon. Radio chatter erupted with disbelief. "How is Hale's tank moving like that? What did they do to that M4? That thing's dancing." German crews noticed too. Reports later indicated confusion among enemy observers who believed the Americans were fielding an upgraded variant. One intercepted communication described it simply: "The lead tank reacts abnormally fast, like it anticipates." For the first time in weeks, American crews felt the tide shifting in their favor. The column broke through the ambush, pushed the Panzers back, and secured the ridge before sunrise. The victory wouldn't make the newspapers, and it certainly wouldn't enter the official war diaries with the detail it deserved. But every man who witnessed the modified Sherman understood that something had changed. Not through a new factory blueprint, not through a command directive, but through one engineer who refused to accept pilot error as the cause of preventable deaths. When they returned to the staging ground, officers immediately inspected the tanks to understand why Hale's vehicle had outperformed the rest. Hale's heart hammered in his chest as they approached. If they opened the compensator housing, the illegal modification would be obvious. But Bennett and Turner stood in front of the Sherman like bodyguards, answering questions with shrugs and half-truths. "Guess we just got lucky," Bennett said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The officers frowned but moved on. Within days, other mechanics approached Hale quietly at night, whispered questions, hints, pleas. "Whatever you did, can you show me?" Hale hesitated, but the faces of Reeves and Lasker haunted him. So he taught them, not with words, but with gestures, with the kind of coded instruction that left no trace on paper. And soon, in hangars from Kovel to Lutsk, reinforced coils and thin metal wedges began appearing in compensator housings under the cover of darkness. None of it was official, none of it was approved, but the battlefield didn't wait for approval. By the second week of April, the modification had spread through the forward maintenance posts like an unspoken secret. One traded between tired hands and whispered through the noise of generators, always out of sight of inspectors and officers who still clung to manuals as if they were holy scripture. Hale noticed it everywhere, sometimes in subtle ways. A mechanic wiping his hands a little too quickly when an officer walked by. A reinforced coil half hidden under a tarp. A row of Shermans responding to throttle tests with a crispness that could only come from the altered compensator tension. It was as if the entire armored regiment had inhaled a breath they didn't know they had been starving for. The first major test came on April 14, 1944. A reconnaissance report warned that German armored elements were attempting to intercept supply convoys moving along the marsh corridors near Torsen. The convoy route had become a graveyard for trucks, Ambushes, mines, sniper fire, and armored support was desperately needed to punch a safe passage. Hale found himself once again assigned to Turner's tank, partly because the crew refused to work without him, and partly because the officers, though suspicious, couldn't deny the coincidental improvement in their tank's combat record. At 9:26 a.m., Turner's Sherman rolled out of the tree line into a clearing still scarred by the wreckage of burned-out vehicles. The air smelled of charred rubber and wet earth. Ahead, smoke rose from a column of supply trucks pinned down behind a low ridge. German half-tracks and a single Panzer IV prowled at the far end of the field, cutting off escape routes like wolves circling prey. Radio chatter was frantic. Hale clenched the handle inside the turret, his eyes tracing the terrain. Before the modification, the Sherman's sluggish response during quick maneuvers made them perfect targets in open fields like this. But now the machine felt coiled, awake. Turner accelerated. The tank surged over the muddy ground, suspension flexing with newfound agility. Bennett loaded armor-piercing rounds, barking coordinates. The Panzer spotted them, turret rotating with deliberate menace. For a moment, Hale felt that old tightening in his chest, the dread of physics running slower than enemy steel. But the Sherman swung left with such immediacy that even Turner swore under his breath. The Panzer's shot went wide, smashing into a dying truck behind them. Turner pushed harder. The transmission groaned, but the compensator held its tension perfectly, distributing force with the precise timing Hale had envisioned in those long nights of frustration. Bennett fired. The shell struck the Panzer's mantlet, causing sparks to flash but not penetrating. "Reload!" Turner shouted. Another German vehicle moved to flank them, a half-track armed with a rapid-fire 20mm cannon. Before, the Sherman would have taken 3, maybe 4 seconds to rotate and gain firing alignment, an eternity under fire. Today, the turret shifted almost instantly. Bennett's second round punched through the Panzer's side armor, sending a geyser of flames erupting from its interior. The half-track fired wildly, 20mm rounds pinging off the Sherman's hull like hail. Turner swung the tank to shield the pinned supply trucks, and Bennett fired again, shredding the half-track's engine block. The German troops inside scrambled out, scattering. The field fell quiet except for the distant pop of rifle fire. Convoys that once begged for air support were now advancing again, saved not by a brilliant tactical overhaul, but by a mechanic's intuition and a few centimeters of reshaped metal. The after-action reports noted improved maneuverability in several Sherman units, but cautiously attributed it to driver adaptation and improved terrain reading. Hale smirked when he saw the wording. They had no idea, or worse, they did and didn't want to admit it, but word did eventually reach them. 3 days later, Hale was summoned to a field tent that served as a temporary command post. Inside, maps littered the tables, radios crackled, and the air smelled of stale coffee and unspoken problems. Captain Wilcox, a man known for his adherence to rules so rigid that some joked he slept with the maintenance manual under his pillow, waited for Hale behind a stack of paperwork. His expression was unreadable. "Corporal Hale," Wilcox said, not looking up. "Your tank's been performing unusually." Hale's pulse quickened. "Sir?" Wilcox finally met his eyes. "I received multiple reports. Tanks in your platoon with transmission response time significantly above expected performance." He tapped a pencil on the table. "Describe what you changed." Hale chose his words carefully. "Routine adjustments, sir. Cleaning tension assemblies, removing debris, tightening components. Technically true, just not complete." Wilcox studied him for a long moment. "I checked with the manufacturer. They say field tension drift is minimal. The kind of responsiveness we're seeing does not come from routine cleaning." Hale stayed silent. Wilcox leaned forward. "If you modified those compensators, you could have endangered the entire regiment." Hale felt heat rising in his face. "Sir, with respect, those compensators were killing us." The sentence hung in the air like a forbidden truth. Wilcox didn't respond for several seconds. Then he closed the file. "Whether you altered them or not, your tank's performance helped save a convoy from annihilation. I don't have the luxury of punishing results that keep my men alive." Hale blinked, confused. Wilcox lowered his voice. "But listen carefully. If inspectors come, you will remove whatever you added. If anyone asks, nothing happened." Hale nodded slowly. That was the closest thing to approval he would ever get. In the following weeks, the pattern intensified. Tanks that received the modification began to dominate skirmishes that previously would have ended in stalemate or loss. German crews noticed and adapted. Their reports, intercepted by Allied intelligence, mentioned hyper-responsive American armor that moved as if weightless. Some chalked it up to new transmissions, others to elite crews. None guessed the truth. A hidden spring from a destroyed light tank, a hand-filed wedge, and an exhausted engineer working by lantern light. But secrecy came with its own dangers. On May 2nd, during a surprise inspection by ordnance officers, mechanics scrambled across the encampment, pulling reinforced coils out of tanks, hiding wedges under toolboxes, even tossing a few into the river. The officers found nothing. Hale watched from a distance, heart hammering as one inspector circled Turner's Sherman, inspecting every bolt. The compensator housing, freshly resealed with factory screws Hale had scavenged for exactly this purpose, passed unnoticed. It was a close call. Too close. That night, Turner, Bennett, and Kowalski gathered with Hale behind the maintenance tents, passing around a tin mug of bitter, weak coffee that tasted more like boiled rust. Turner laughed softly. "You know they're gonna write books someday about how the Sherman turned the tide." Bennett snorted. "Yeah, and none of them will mention the guy in the mud who actually fixed it." Hale shrugged. "Doesn't matter who gets the credit. What matters is, the next kid doesn't die because the tank couldn't move." But even as he said it, a quiet ache settled in his chest. Not for recognition. He never cared for that. But for the truth that would never be told. The war machine was a giant, and giants didn't bother remembering the hands that patched their wounds. Still, every time he watched a modified Sherman sprint across terrain where it once stumbled, Hale felt something close to pride, though tinged with the strange melancholy that comes when you realize history is being written in real time, and you are its ghost. By June 1944, the front had shifted again, swallowing old positions and spitting out new ones with the same indifferent brutality that defined every campaign of the war. Hale continued working from whatever makeshift depots the regiment built, sometimes a barn with half a roof, sometimes a strip of forest where trees served as tool racks, sometimes a ruined schoolhouse where children's chalk drawings still clung to broken walls. Tanks rolled in and out like wounded animals, and Hale patched them back together, never acknowledging the growing number of crews who specifically asked for him by name. If Hale touched it, some said quietly, "It'll bring you home." The modification, his modification, never appeared in official technical manuals. It never received a field order designation or an engineering code. It survived purely through the hands of the men who needed it, spreading from Sherman to Sherman like a rumor that refused to die, no matter how often officers demanded that all tanks be kept in standard configuration. Inspectors continued to visit, but by then the mechanics had perfected the ritual. Remove the wedge before dawn, reseal the housing, salute the officers, then put everything back the moment the trucks disappeared over the ridge. In the cruel language of war, the modification became both illegal and indispensable, and yet, the consequences of its existence were impossible to ignore. By early summer, the regiment's reports showed a sharp decline in mobility-related casualties. Tanks that once lagged now maneuvered with surprising confidence, engaging German armor without the fatal hesitation that had previously doomed them. Commanders argued late into the night about whether the improvements came from better training or environmental acclimation. A few suspected something more. None were willing to challenge results that saved fuel, saved time, saved lives. For Hale, the real victories were smaller, quieter. A thumbs up from a crew returning from a firefight, a brief handshake from a sergeant who'd lost half his men before the modification, and almost none after. A single nod from Kowalski after a battle near the Steyr River, where the Sherman had taken 2 direct hits but managed to reverse out of danger with a speed that would have been impossible months earlier. Hale lived for these moments, even as he carried the weight of knowing he would never claim them. The war finally pushed westward, and as the summer ground on, Hale found himself repairing fewer tanks and more trucks, half-tracks and jeeps. The Shermans, now seasoned and battered but astonishingly reliable, were pushing deeper into German-held territory. Rumors spread that the manufacturer had sent experts to inspect units in the field. Some said they were quietly impressed. Others whispered they were furious. Someone had altered their design without authorization, and the change had proven them wrong. One evening in late August, as the regiment bivouacked near a ruined Polish estate, Hale spotted 2 men in civilian coats walking between the rows of tanks, clipboards in hand, speaking to officers in hushed tones. He watched them nervously from behind a stack of fuel drums. If they opened Turner's tank or any tank touched by the modification, they'd know instantly. He braced himself for consequences he had long expected, but nothing happened. The men inspected engines, armor plates, radio system, and left the compensator housings untouched. Either they didn't know what to look for, Or they already knew and didn't want to face the implications. Perhaps it was easier to pretend the machines had simply adapted under battlefield stress. War had a way of burying truths that didn't fit neatly into procurement reports or engineering pride. When autumn came and the leaves turned the color of dried blood, the regiment rotated back from the front for rest. Hale, exhausted beyond words, returned to a rear area depot where the tanks were cleaned, repainted, and prepared for the next push. One afternoon, as he tightened bolts on a fuel pump, Turner approached him with a small box wrapped in brown paper. "They found this in the mail truck," Turner said, handing it over. Hale frowned and peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a simple pocket knife, its wooden grip polished smooth. A note was folded beneath it. "For the man who fixed the machine that brought my son home. You don't know me, but I'll thank you every day for the rest of my life." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Hale stared at the knife for a long time, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. An ache made not of sorrow, but of the strange, quiet humility that comes when you realize your greatest act will never be spoken aloud. Turner clapped him on the shoulder, and for a moment the noise of the depot, engines rumbling, hammers striking steel, men shouting, faded into something distant and soft. When the war finally ended, Hale returned to Kansas with little more than his duffel bag and the pocket knife. He married, raised 2 sons, and opened a small garage behind his house. Neighbors brought him tractors, trucks, broken radios, anything with a stubborn gear or a misaligned drive. He fixed them all with the same calm patience he had once used on tanks under fire. He rarely spoke of the war, except on rare nights when the wind carried the smell of hot oil and damp earth, and even then, he spoke only in fragments. But the men who served with him remembered. Each year, letters arrived, sometimes from Turner, sometimes from Bennett, sometimes from families of crews Hale had never met. They all said variations of the same thing. Because of what you did, someone lived. And so the story passed quietly from soldier to soldier, from father to daughter, from one aging veteran to another at reunions, where few could still stand without support. It never appeared in official histories, never earned a commendation, never changed the outcome of the war on any grand strategic map. But it changed everything for the men who survived because a tank moved when it needed to. War is often told through the voices of generals, through blueprints and battle plans, through the sweeping declarations of nations. But victory is built by ghosts in the mud, by field engineers who see the flaw no one else will acknowledge, who dare to fix what the manual forbids, who save lives without expecting their own names to be engraved anywhere at all. And if you ever come across a Sherman that still carries a strange responsiveness in its bones, remember that somewhere, long before the world had quieted, a man named Nathan Hale crawled beneath an exhausted tank in the dark and refused to let hesitation kill one more crew.